Foundations for Reconstruction, Part 5. The most neglected command in the church. If I were retitling this right now, I would change it. I would say the most misunderstood commandment in the church, probably. Right here, a few years back, I was working through Romans 14. I preached a Sunday morning message, and I believe the title was, Is There Such a Thing as the Lord's Day? Paul's words where some esteem one day, some another, some treat all days alike. And when you read that passage, is Paul teaching us that there's no such thing as a Lord's Day? In a nutshell, the conclusion is no, that's not what Paul was teaching. As I was walking out, a number of people said different things, and a person whom you would know, if I said his name, you would all know, a prominent Christian leader, came up to me and he said, so when do you celebrate your personal Sabbath? And I said, well, I worship on Sunday. He said, no, I mean your Sabbath, your rest. And I thought, he thinks that the fourth commandment is about setting a day apart where you just rest from physical work. That's why I would retitle this, if I was doing it right now, the most misunderstood commandment. And I want to explain to you why I think that's a poor understanding. All right? That's where I want to go tonight. Why I think that's a poor understanding. Two texts, Exodus 28 to 11, Deuteronomy 5, 12 to 15. First, Exodus 28 to 11. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor, do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. You, or your son, or your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day. Sabbath means seventh, and made it holy. Deuteronomy 5. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. And it sounds the same. 6 days you shall labor, do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your ox or your donkey or any of your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. Okay, that's pretty much the same. And then this. Deuteronomy, by the way, means second law. Deuteronomy means second law. So what you have in Deuteronomy is Moses preaching about the Ten Commandments that he received. So you get this extra detail, 15. You shall remember. So remember the Sabbath day. There's Exodus 20. Remember the Sabbath day. Remember what? What are we supposed to remember? Deuteronomy 5:15. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. And the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. And therefore, for this reason, because of this, because you were slaves in Egypt, and I brought you out. That's why, therefore, because of this, God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. On that Sunday, when I was working through Romans 14, I told in brief the story about Eric Liddell. Do you pronounce Eric Little or Liddell? How many say Liddell? How many say Little? Okay, Liddell wins. Eric was a Scottish athlete who trained his whole life to compete in the 1924 Olympic Games. We all know his story from the movie Chariots of Fire, and people have been running in slow motion ever since. Most of us can't even imagine the work and the dedication required to make it to the Olympics. I mean, we see TV commercials praising the dedication of such athletes. They put everything else in their life on hold just to give themselves to the pursuit of Olympic gold. Incredible discipline. Eric Liddell did win a gold medal, but amazingly, that's not what he's now famous for. He's famous for the conflict of his life, which came when he discovered that the race he had prepared all his life for, that particular race was going to be held on Sunday. And we just laugh as though that were some kind of issue. Eric was a devout Christian, and he felt that he couldn't participate because it would be a breaching of the commandment that we're studying today. Rightly or wrongly, that's what he felt. So because of that, he switched races, competed in another event entirely on another day, and still won the gold medal. Most people don't even know. Later on, Eric became a missionary. He died in the 40s. He died in the 40s in a prisoner of war camp in China for spreading the gospel. Now, the world's changed a lot since then. Probably, if we were honest, there's very few of us in this room who honestly think he would have done any damage to his immortal soul had he competed in that race on Sunday. He may have violated his conscience, which is another Romans 14 issue. But he certainly wouldn't be breaking this commandment. And yet this fourth commandment, this command about setting a day apart for God, it's striking to me that this is the only one, this is the only command that begins with that word remember, especially in the Exodus 20 original giving of the account. Remember the Sabbath day. And so we're given a clue. We're given a clue with that word, remember. We're given a clue that this command only points to something that was already in place. The commandment calls them not just to observe, but to remember. Remember something already said. So we know that whatever's being dealt with this day apart, we know that that word remember means that this has been revealed in a way that predates the command itself. It makes no sense to say remember if there's nothing that predates that command. We're not told to remember that killing is wrong. We're not told to remember that stealing is wrong. We're not told to remember that committing adultery is wrong. But we're told when it comes to this day, we're told now remember. Remember something already in place. It's in place creationally. It's something God initiated when He created the heavens and the earth. We're told that we must resist by remembering. Resist the mindlessness that is so common about a day. That word remember means there's something already made known that I'm likely to forget or overlook or just not treat as important. My parents used to frequently leave the house, leave the 4 Horban boys alone, especially when the older 2 were a little older. My folks never once left the house and said, now remember, don't forget, remember, eat all the potato chips and cake and ice cream. They frequently said, remember, turn off the TV and do your homework. Because they knew you don't have to tell 4 boys to remember to eat the potato chips and the cake and the Coke and the ice cream. Occasionally, they do need to be reminded about homework. Remember this day. Point number 1. We're going to be on this for 2 Sunday nights, so I'm just going to be quick tonight. Don't panic. The command is to celebrate the faithfulness and goodness of our Creator God. And I already said that word remember points us backwards. So in a sense, this command predates the Mosaic law, the 10 Commandments, the law given on Mount Sinai. You see that in 2011. For in 6 days, here's what to remember. In 6 days the Lord made, this is creation now. This is before Moses is on the scene. In 6 days the Lord made heaven, the earth, the sea, all that is in them, and rested on the Sabbath day. Therefore, past tense, Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. When did he do that? Not on Sinai, not with the giving of the commandments. When he created the world and all that is in it. That's when a day was set apart. So Moses didn't make the day holy. God did. It didn't become holy on Mount Sinai. Its roots go back, way back before the law itself, to the creation of the world. The text says God did something on the seventh day. It says he rested. And we all stop and say, wait a minute. There's something weird about that. God rested. Omnipotent, almighty, fatigueless, who never sleeps, the Bible says. Can you just imagine? Never, ever, ever sleeping, not for 1 second. What do you mean he rested? And I just have a hard time picturing, when you see how he created, he speaks. He just speaks. And it all happens. It's amazing. I have a hard time imagining after 6 days, can you see God just going, I am just beat. I cannot create one more tree. I'm just going to fall over dead. I've had it. It can't be that. And the creation account gives us some help here. And notice, by the way, on the side, the seemingly literal creation assumptions that are given by God himself in Exodus 20:11. So in Genesis we read that God rested, not because he was overwhelmed with fatigue, but to pause and celebrate the goodness of the created world. That's what God did on the seventh day. He openly stopped and said, this is good. This is wonderful. So this commandment stands as a reminder to reflect. Reflect the way God did. God rested. Rest that way. It's not a matter of lounging by the pool. That's fine if you got a pool. I'm not knocking that. But that's not what this is about. The rest has to do with, first of all, there'll be something else in a minute, but first of all, reflecting on God's power, his creative majesty over all that is, to reflect on who made us, you are not your own, to reflect on the one to whom we must one day give an account. Apparently we need 1 day in 7 to straighten out our lives and reorient them around some basic truths, or we'll forget about them. Not forget in the sense that we can't call them to memory, but forget about them in the sense that they won't shape our activities anymore. How much does it matter that people remember God's creative power, greatness, and wonder? How important is it? And I was reading, this isn't in your notes, I was reading Romans 1:20 to 25. You know, where God talks about his invisible attributes, his eternal power, divine nature, how they've been so visible since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. And then he says, for although they knew God, they did not honor him as God. They didn't honor him. They didn't give thanks to him. It became futile in their thinking. Something happened. They didn't remember something. Or give thanks to him, became futile in their thinking. Their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. Exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, birds, animals, reptiles. God gave them up to lusts. The lusts of their hearts to impurity, to dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. Because, why? Because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie. They worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator. No wonder. Remember, take a day in 7 and just stop and say, there is a Creator over all who made all things, who is wonderful and powerful and holy and omniscient. Don't squeeze this into 2 minutes. 1/7 of your life should drive your mind and heart to that truth. Why? Because without that, you become futile in your thinking. And you'll start worshiping the wrong things. You might not carve an idol. You might start worshiping your investments or your new car or your possessions. But you'll certainly get your life steered the wrong way. It takes 1/7 of your life to keep the other 6/7 properly focused. Idolatry is what people do when they don't take a day to remember their Creator. Lives get bound up in slavery to self and addiction. People use other people instead of loving them. They worship possessions. That's how important this is. It keeps a sacred focus to all of life. Let me deal with one other thing. I know, you've heard it said 1,000 times. You know, I can worship God at the cottage. I can worship God on the golf course. Why this command to? It's this call that sort of separates a day. It separates a block, a chunk of time, and just sort of quarantines it and says, this day don't do anything but this. This day focus on the greatness of your God in a way that is not divided with attention given to other things. That's concentrated. It's not diluted with other things. Make this the one pursuit of this one day. So yeah, I know we're to live all of our lives. There's a sense in which all of my life is to be lived to the glory of God, whether I'm at the cottage or at work or on the golf course or wherever I am and whatever I do. I get that. But that's not what this command is about. This command is designed to sort of jar my earthly patterns so that my soul has to be awakened, like a speed bump in a parking lot. You can't properly remember God without giving Him that much time. Remember. That's what we're to remember. Okay, so that's the first thing. We're going to look at two things. The first thing is, this commandment is a summons to take 1 day in 7 and to remember the greatness of our God, to keep our lives from becoming idolatrous. Point number 2. The command is to celebrate God's redemptive deliverance of His people. And now you get expanded revelation, a fuller picture. This is the emphasis, particularly in Deuteronomy chapter 5. I'm not going to read the whole thing again, but Deuteronomy 5, I was looking at 12 to 15, but if you just look at 15, you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. And the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, here's why the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day, the seventh day. Now, I hope you see where we're going here. From our first point, 1 day set apart, not just in the commandments. Okay, it predates the commandments, this principle. 1 day in creation, set apart to reflect on the God who made everything, how great and good He is. There, you need a day for that. I'm to remember that my days, my hours, they come from His hand. They belong to Him, not just symbolically, but literally. And that has to be reestablished. Now, the second point expands on this, and this is where, pay attention, this is where the shift comes in understanding Sabbath day to Lord's Day. And what the keeping of this commandment means to the Christian, and how what that brother said to me, I think, is a mistake. What's your Sabbath day? And he meant, when do you just rest? And what I want to say to you is, however good you might think of that as a life principle, and if you can afford to do it, that's great. But that's not what the command is about for the Christian, and this is where I get that conclusion. The second point is, we need this day set apart, because we pause and remember that God is, first of all, a good, powerful creator God. But secondly, and Revelation expands now, we remember that our God is a God who delivers his people from bondage. You see that in that Deuteronomy, the 15th verse, so clearly. And it's in this second point that we see the best place to focus on the change from the Sabbath, seventh in the Old Testament, to the Lord's Day, the first day of the week in the New Testament. Moses records that God's people were to reflect on one aspect of God's goodness and power in particular. God was a delivering God. He was a God who brought them out of bondage that they couldn't get out of in a million years on their own. Their lives were bound in something that was overpowering. And they were hopelessly bound. They didn't just need more time. They would never get out. But their God is a delivering God. Remember, your God delivers from bondage. Now, what the New Testament does, it says, okay, there, Cedar View, there, that point ushers in a Christian understanding of this commandment. Look at Hebrews. We're closer to done than you think, so don't panic. Hebrews chapter 4, verses 9 through 16, where the writer, I think the Apostle Paul, but it doesn't matter who you think wrote the book of Hebrews. It's anonymously written. The writer picks up this idea specifically of Sabbath and rest. Okay, so now you have the New Testament dealing specifically with this subject for the church. Hebrews 4:9. So then, there remains a Sabbath rest. You see it? So there's something that remains. Here's a principle he's saying. This abides right now for the church. So then, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works. Rested from his works. That's the phrase. As God did from his. Well, we know how God rested from his. He celebrated the goodness of his creative power. So we do that. And then we know we're to remember his delivering power from bondage. 11. Let us therefore strive to enter that rest. Isn't that a strange phrase? Strive and rest. You'd think entering rest, the last thing you'd want to do is strive. But let us strive to enter that rest. In other words, there's something in all of us that wants to rely on our works rather than God's grace. Strive to enter his rest. So that no one may fall by the same sort of disobedience. And this is where this famous verse comes into play. For the word of God is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing to the division of soul and spirit, joints and of marrow, and discerning the thoughts and intentions of the heart. No creature is hidden from his sight, but all are naked and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must give account. So you won't even think about giving account unless you remember your Creator. Since then we have a great high priest. Okay, here's another concept now. He's talked about entering into rest. You see in verse 10, whoever has entered God's rest has rested from his works. How do you rest from your works? Well, we have a high priest. 14. Since then we have a great high priest, that's the source of our rest, who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Here's the kind of rest that we enter into. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we might find mercy and find grace to help in the time of need. So that, verse 10, for whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. We're called back not to the Ten Commandments, but to the creation of the world. And this verse makes a direct link between God resting after his creation work and Jesus resting after his redemptive work. And then the first 9 words of verse 11 call us to enter into that rest. Let us therefore strive to enter that rest. What rest? The work that comes from our high priest, Jesus Christ. There was a lot there. Let me just wrap up by putting this together. Let's put the pieces together. Because to limit our understanding of the Lord's Day by framing it with a legalistic Old Testament interpretation of merely a day of rest from activity, because that misses the new covenant remodeling of what the Lord's Day is all about, we need to think about this. Why do we celebrate on the first day instead of the seventh? Why do we celebrate the first day instead of the seventh? Well, we celebrate the Lord's Day on the first day of the week because that's the pattern of the early church. But where did they get the idea? Well, they got it from the teaching of passages like that Hebrews passage. They got it because we start our week standing on a finished work. We begin our week entering into the rest of a high priest. And we do it on the first day of the week, Christ's resurrection, because it pictures a rest of faith that was never earned by any preceding works of merit. So it's not the last day with 6 days in front of it. It's the first day of the week with nothing in front of it. Because it didn't come from anything we did. We're resting on what Jesus accomplished in his redemption. And what we're doing when we do that is we're remembering the words in Deuteronomy, remember your God is a God who delivers from bondage. Only in the New Testament, we worship on the Lord's Day, and the bondage isn't Egypt. The bondage is sin and self. Let me say it this way. Here's where I think my Christian brother was mistaken. The Lord's Day is related to the Sabbath in the same way that the cross and resurrection is related to the death of animals offered in sacrifices in the Old Testament. In other words, the Lord's Day doesn't contradict the Old Testament Sabbath. The Lord's Day defines and fulfills and completes what kind of rest the Old Testament Sabbath was looking forward to. And it was a rest from the works of our salvation in a completed work of our high priest. It's not the kind of rest people picture. It's not the rest of lying on a beach or barbecuing burgers on the patio. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's just relaxation. The Lord's Day celebrates and reflects on and praises God for the rest of sins forgiven. The rest of a life focused on the freeing power of praise and worship of our God. The rest of a joyful obedience to commands that are no longer a burden because of the new life of the Holy Spirit in the soul. The rest of a redemption that is safe and sure in Jesus Christ. And it's celebrating these things with a day that keeps it undistracted from the other pursuits of my life. Singers, musicians, come on up. So we worship on the Lord's Day. And when we do, we're not ignoring the Sabbath command. We're fulfilling it. We're fulfilling it. Because the rest that it looked forward to is not just the rest of relaxation. It's a rest from producing our own salvation. It's the rest of pleasing God by our own works. And we best celebrate that when we come on the Lord's Day at the beginning of the week and celebrate a ruling, reigning, resurrected high priest. We can come before the throne of grace in a way that Moses could have only dreamed of. No lamb? What? No lamb? No offering? No grain? No goats? No pigeons? No shed blood? No. It's a rest from all that. but it's a rest that worships our risen Lord. And everyone said,